The thunder of hooves echoed across the dusty plains as Penelope Baxter raced her chestnut mare toward the small homestead in the distance. The smoke rising from its chimney, a beacon in the waning Montana twilight of 1878. She had been riding for nearly 6 hours straight, her medical bag bouncing against her hip, responding to a desperate plea delivered by a ranch hand who had ridden into town with wild eyes and an even wilder tale of a dying infant. "Just a little farther, Maple," Penelope urged her tired horse, leaning forward in the saddle. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and deep purples, casting long shadows across the prairie grass that swayed in the evening breeze. As a newly qualified doctor in the frontier town of Whispering Creek, Penelope had become accustomed to urgent summons, but something about this one gripped her heart more tightly than usual. The small homestead grew closer, its weathered wooden frame standing resolute against the vast emptiness of the western landscape. A corral with 3 horses stood to the side, and a small garden patch, now withered with the onset of autumn, bordered one wall. Penelope dismounted quickly, her boots hitting the hard, packed earth with determination. She grabbed her medical bag and hurried toward the door, not bothering to tether Maple, who was too exhausted to wander far. She knocked once firmly, and when no answer came, she pushed the door open. The sight that met her eyes stopped her in her tracks. In the dim light of a single oil lamp, a broad-shouldered man knelt beside a small bed, his head bowed, his voice a rough whisper as he cradled a tiny bundle against his chest. The infant's weak cries pierced the silence intermittently, each sound fainter than the last. "Please, God," the man was saying, his voice cracking with emotion. "She's all I have left. Please don't take her too." Penelope stepped forward, the floorboard creaking beneath her weight. The man's head whipped around, revealing a face etched with exhaustion and fear. His eyes, a startling shade of blue even in the dim light, widened at the sight of her. "Dr. Baxter?" he asked, hope and desperation mingling in his voice. "Yes," she replied, already moving toward him and the child. "I came as soon as I heard." "Thank God," he breathed, rising to his full height, which towered over her 5'4" frame. "I'm Vaughn James. This is my daughter, Emma. She's been burning with fever for 2 days now, and I can't get it to break." Penelope set her bag down and held out her arms. "May I?" With visible reluctance, Vaughn handed over the tiny bundle. The baby couldn't have been more than 6 months old, her small face flushed with fever, wisps of dark hair plastered to her forehead. Penelope quickly unwrapped the blanket, feeling the heat radiating from the child's body. "How long has she been refusing to nurse?" she asked, laying the baby gently on the table she had cleared with one sweep of her arm. "Since yesterday morning. I've been trying to get some water into her, but she barely takes it," Vaughn replied, hovering anxiously at her side. "Her mother," his voice caught, "her mother died in childbed. I've been caring for her myself." Penelope nodded, her fingers expertly examining the baby. "Has she had any coughing, trouble breathing?" "Yes, both. Started 3 days ago, got worse fast." Penelope pressed her ear to the child's chest, listening to the labored breathing and the concerning rattle that accompanied each intake of breath. Pneumonia. It had to be, the scourge of frontier winters. It claimed so many children before they had a chance to grow. "Mr. James," she said, straightening up, "I need clean water as much as you can heat, and clean cloths. Do you have any willow bark?" Yes, I think so," he stammered, already moving to obey. "Is she going to? I'm going to do everything I can," Penelope promised, meeting his gaze directly. "But we need to act quickly." As Vaughn hurried to gather what she needed, Penelope turned her attention back to the infant. Emma's breathing was shallow, her tiny chest working too hard for each breath. Penelope had seen pneumonia claim too many lives in her 3 years of practice, but she refused to let it take this child if she could help it. "I'm here now, little one," she whispered, stroking Emma's fevered cheek. "And I'll do everything I can to help you." The night stretched long before them, a battle fought with hot compresses, willow bark tea administered drop by painstaking drop, and the constant vigilance of 2 adults determined not to let death claim its prize. Penelope worked tirelessly, her medical training guiding her hands as she cared for the sick infant. Vaughn moved around her like a shadow, anticipating her needs before she voiced them, his quiet efficiency belying the fear she could see in his eyes. "She's fighting," Penelope murmured as dawn approached, the first pale light seeping through the single window. "That's a good sign." Vaughn's large, calloused hand gently brushed a strand of hair from Emma's forehead. "She's stubborn, like her mother." Penelope glanced up at him, noticing for the first time the fine lines around his eyes, the way his dark hair curled slightly where it met his collar. He couldn't be much older than her 25 years, yet there was a weariness to him that spoke of hardships endured. "Tell me about her mother," she said softly, changing the cloth on Emma's forehead for a fresh, cool one. Vaughn was silent for so long that Penelope thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice was low and rough with emotion. "Sarah was sunshine. That's the only way I can describe her. We came out here from Boston 3 years ago, wanted to make our own way. She loved this land even when it was hard, especially when it was hard." He smiled faintly. "She'd just stand out there sometimes, looking at the mountains, and say it was like seeing God's own painting fresh on the canvas." "She sounds wonderful," Penelope said sincerely. She was. "When we found out about the baby, she was so happy. Started making plans right away, talking about teaching our child to ride, to read, all the things she loved." His voice dropped to a whisper. "I never thought I'd have to do it all without her." Penelope reached across the small bed and briefly squeezed his hand. "You're doing a fine job, Mr. James. A lesser man might have given up. Giving up isn't in my nature, Doctor." "Baxter," he replied, meeting her eyes with an intensity that made her look away. "Nor mine," she said, returning her attention to Emma. "And I believe it's not in your daughter's nature either." As if in response to Penelope's words, Emma stirred, her tiny face scrunching up before releasing a cry stronger than any sound she had made all night. "That's it," Penelope encouraged, relief washing over her. "Let us hear you, little one." The baby's fever broke just as the sun crested the distant mountains, bathing the small cabin in golden light. Penelope felt Emma's forehead, then her chest, noting the less labored breathing and cooler skin with profound relief. "The fever's broken," she announced, looking up to find Vaughn watching her with an expression she couldn't quite define. "You saved her," he said simply, his voice thick with emotion. "She saved herself," Penelope corrected gently. "I just helped her along." "You answered my prayers," Vaughn insisted, and before she could react, he had caught her hand and pressed it to his lips in a gesture of such sincere gratitude that Penelope felt her cheeks flush. It's what any doctor would have done," she stammered, withdrawing her hand awkwardly. "Not any doctor would have ridden 6 hours to reach an isolated homestead," he pointed out. "Jeffries told me he wasn't sure you'd come." "Jeffries doesn't know me very well," she replied tartly, remembering the ranch hand's doubtful expression when she had immediately saddled Maple upon receiving his message. Vaughn chuckled, the sound rusty as if he hadn't laughed in a very long time. "No, I suppose he doesn't." Emma made a small noise, drawing both their attentions back to her. Her eyes, the same startling blue as her father's, were open now, looking around with the unfocused curiosity of infancy. "Hello, darling," Vaughn whispered, gathering her into his arms with a tenderness that made Penelope's heart contract strangely. "You gave your papa quite a scare." Watching them together, Penelope felt like an intruder on a sacred moment. She busied herself packing her medical supplies, giving father and daughter some privacy for their reunion. "You must be exhausted," Vaughn said suddenly, looking up from his daughter's face to Penelope's. "I didn't even think you've been up all night after that long ride." "I'm fine," she assured him, stifling a yawn that immediately betrayed her words. "But I should start back to town soon." "Nonsense," he said firmly. "You can barely keep your eyes open, and your horse needs rest too. I insist you stay and sleep for a few hours at least." Penelope hesitated. It wasn't proper, of course, for an unmarried woman to stay in a man's home unchaperoned. But then again, nothing about her life conformed to society's narrow view of propriety. A female doctor on the frontier was already scandalous enough in many people's eyes. "I have a spare room," Vaughn added, as if reading her thoughts. Sarah's sewing room, there's a Dabed in there. The mention of his late wife somehow made the offer more acceptable. Thank you, Penelope conceded. Perhaps just for a few hours, Vaughn nodded, his relief evident. I'll show you. The room was small but neat, with a window overlooking the eastern plains. A half-finished quilt lay draped over the back of a rocking chair, and bundles of dried herbs hung from the ceiling, filling the air with a pleasant, earthy scent. It's lovely, Penelope said honestly. Sarah would be pleased someone was using it, Vaughn replied, his voice soft. I'll let you rest. Left alone, Penelope sank onto the narrow Dabed, too tired to even remove her boots. The last thing she saw before sleep claimed her was the rising sun illuminating a small wooden frame on the wall, a pressed wildflower preserved between glass, a splash of prairie beauty saved from time's passage. When Penelope awoke, the sun was high in the sky. She sat up quickly, disoriented for a moment before remembering where she was. She had slept far longer than intended. Hastily smoothing her rumpled dress and attempting to tame her unruly auburn hair, she emerged from the small room. The main room of the cabin was empty, but the door stood open, allowing a pleasant breeze to circulate. Penelope stepped outside, shading her eyes against the bright midday sun. The sound of a baby's gurgle drew her attention to the small garden at the side of the house. There sat Vaughn on an overturned crate, Emma propped on his knee as he showed her something in his hand, a tiny yellow flower, which she was attempting to grab with chubby, uncoordinated fingers. See this, Emma. Your mama called these butter daisies, he was saying in the gentle voice reserved solely for his daughter. She said they were the happiest flowers on the prairie. Penelope remained still, reluctant to intrude on the tender scene. But Emma spotted her, letting out an excited sound and waving her arms. Vaughn turned, his face lighting up when he saw Penelope. Look who's awake, Emma, he said, rising to his feet with the baby secure in his arms. The lady who made you better. How is she? Penelope asked, crossing to them and placing a hand on Emma's forehead. Still cool, that's good. She's much improved, Vaughn confirmed. Even took some milk earlier. Excellent, that's exactly what we want to see. Penelope smiled as Emma reached for her finger, gripping it with surprising strength. You're going to be just fine, aren't you, little one? Are you hungry? Vaughn asked. I've made some stew. It's nothing fancy, but it's hot. That sounds wonderful, Penelope admitted, suddenly aware of how empty her stomach felt. But I really should be getting back to town after. I have patients waiting and, of course, Vaughn nodded, though she thought she detected a flicker of disappointment in his eyes. I understand. But please, eat something first. The stew was simple but hearty, chunks of venison and wild onions in a rich broth. Penelope ate gratefully while Vaughn sat opposite her at the small table, Emma dozing in a makeshift cradle nearby. You're quite good with her, Penelope observed. Many men would have hired a nurse or sent the child to relatives after. She trailed off, not wanting to mention his loss so directly. Emma is all I have left of Sarah, Vaughn said simply. I couldn't bear to part with her. Besides, we have no family out here, it's just us. It must be difficult managing the ranch and caring for an infant alone. It is, he acknowledged, but I wouldn't have it any other way, though I will admit there are moments when I feel entirely out of my depth. He smiled ruefully. Sarah would probably laugh to see some of my attempts at mothering. I think she would be proud, Penelope said softly. Their eyes met across the table, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits. Both had chosen lives that defied conventional expectations. How did you come to be a doctor? Vaughn asked, breaking the moment. It's not a common path for a woman. Penelope took a sip of water before answering. My father was a physician in Philadelphia. He had no sons, just me and my 3 sisters. I was always following him around, asking questions about his work. When I was 16, he started taking me with him on house calls. She smiled at the memory. My mother was horrified, of course, said it wasn't proper. But my father believed women had just as much right to education and profession as men. He sounds like a wise man. He was. He died 5 years ago, influenza. That's when I decided to come west. There was nothing keeping me in Philadelphia, and I knew frontier towns were desperate for doctors. She shrugged. It seemed like the place I could do the most good. And has it been what you hoped for? Penelope considered the question thoughtfully. Yes and no. The work is rewarding but challenging in ways I hadn't anticipated. And there's still resistance to a woman doctor, even out here where people can't afford to be picky. Their loss, Vaughn said firmly. You saved my daughter when no one else could or would come. Penelope felt her cheeks warm at his praise. Speaking of which, I should leave you with instructions for her care. The danger has passed, but she'll need continued attention to fully recover. She spent the next few minutes explaining what to watch for, how to prepare a lighter version of the willow bark tea if the fever showed any signs of returning, and when Emma could resume her normal feeding schedule. I'll come back in a few days to check on her, she promised as she gathered her things. Sooner if you notice any worrying signs. I'd be grateful, Vaughn said, walking her to where Maple stood saddled and waiting. He had insisted on preparing the horse while she finished her meal. For what it's worth, Dr. Baxter, I think you're exactly where you're meant to be. The sincerity in his voice made her pause as she adjusted her medical bag on the saddle. Thank you, Mr. James. Vaughn, please, he corrected. After spending the night fighting for my daughter's life together, I think we can dispense with formalities. Vaughn, she repeated, testing the name, then you must call me Penelope. Penelope, he said, and something about the way her name sounded in his deep voice made her stomach flutter unexpectedly. Safe journey back to town. He helped her mount, his hands strong and steady at her waist. As she turned Maple toward town, she looked back to see him standing before his modest homestead. Emma cradled in one arm, the other raised in farewell. For reasons she couldn't quite explain, Penelope found herself thinking about Vaughn James and his daughter long after the homestead had disappeared from view. True to her word, Penelope returned to the James homestead 3 days later. The ride seemed shorter this time, perhaps because she wasn't racing against time, or perhaps because the destination now held something more than professional obligation. She found Vaughn in the corral, working with a spirited young colt. He moved with the easy confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime around horses, his voice low and soothing as he guided the animal around the enclosure. Emma was secured in an improvised sling across his chest, watching the proceedings with wide-eyed fascination. The domestic tableau made Penelope smile. She dismounted and approached the fence, calling out a greeting to avoid startling man or beast. Vaughn looked up, his face breaking into a warm smile that transformed his features. Penelope, he called back, immediately securing the lead rope and making his way toward her. I didn't expect you so soon. I said a few days, she reminded him, her eyes going to Emma. And how is our patient? See for yourself, he said proudly, adjusting the sling so Emma faced outward. The baby looked remarkably improved. Her cheeks had regained a healthy color, and her blue eyes were alert and curious. Well, look at you, Penelope exclaimed, delighted. You're looking much better, little one. Emma gurgled in response, reaching out pudgy hands toward Penelope. She remembers you, Vaughn said softly. Smart girl. May I? Penelope asked, holding out her arms. Vaughn carefully extracted Emma from the sling and handed her over. The baby immediately grabbed at Penelope's hair, which had escaped its pins during the ride. Oh no, that's not for pulling, Penelope laughed, gently disentangling Emma's fingers from her auburn curls. She looked up to find Vaughn watching them with a strange expression. What is it? Nothing, he said quickly, then seemed to reconsider. It's just... She hasn't taken to anyone like that since Sarah, usually fusses something awful with strangers. Penelope felt oddly touched by this information. Well, we did spend a rather intense night together, she pointed out lightly. Perhaps that formed a bond. Perhaps, Vaughn agreed. Come inside. I just put some coffee on before I went to work with Thunder. Thunder? Penelope asked, following him toward the cabin with Emma still in her arms. The colt. Named for the storm he was born during, Vaughn explained over his shoulder. Ornery as they come, but he's got potential. The interior of the cabin seemed brighter than Penelope remembered. Or perhaps it was just the absence of fear and illness that made it seem more welcoming. Vaughn poured coffee into 2 tin cups and set them on the table before taking Emma back, settling her on a blanket on the floor with a wooden spoon to play with. "I've been meaning to ride into town to thank you properly," Vaughn said as they sat. "But with the ranch work and Emma—" "No need to explain," Penelope assured him. "I understand how demanding both responsibilities are. Besides, I wanted to check on Emma anyway." She sipped her coffee, surprisingly good for bachelor-made brew. "Have you been following the instructions I left to the letter?" he confirmed. "Though she hasn't needed the tea again, thankfully. Her appetite is back full force, too." "Excellent, that's the best sign." Penelope smiled down at the baby, who was contentedly banging the spoon against the floor. "I think she's well on her way to recovery." "Thanks to you," Vaughn said, his voice dropping to a more serious tone. "I don't know how I can ever repay you, Penelope." "It's my job," she reminded him. "You don't need to repay me." "Maybe not, but I'd like to try." He hesitated, then plunged ahead. "The Harvest Festival is happening in town next weekend. I was wondering if you might consider attending it with Emma and me." The invitation caught Penelope off guard. It sounded suspiciously like a social engagement rather than a professional one. I usually help with the medical tent during festivals," she hedged. "Of course," Vaughn nodded, looking down at his coffee. "I understand completely." But Penelope found herself adding, "Perhaps I could meet you there, once my duties are completed." The smile that lit Vaughn's face made her heart perform an unexpected somersault in her chest. "That would be wonderful," he said. "Emma and I will look forward to it." The week leading up to the Harvest Festival passed in a blur of activity for Penelope. Autumn brought its usual array of ailments to Whispering Creek, keeping her busy from dawn until dusk. Still, her thoughts often strayed to the quiet homestead on the prairie and its 2 inhabitants. On the day of the festival, Penelope worked diligently in the medical tent, treating everything from minor cuts to a sprained ankle. By mid-afternoon, the flow of patients had slowed enough that Dr. Howard, the elderly physician who had reluctantly accepted Penelope as his colleague 2 years prior, shooed her away. "Go enjoy yourself, Dr. Baxter," he insisted. "You've been working non-stop for days." "Are you sure?" Penelope asked, even as she untied her apron. "Quite sure." "I can handle a few scrapes and bruises on my own," he replied dryly. "I was doing it for 30 years before you arrived, after all." Penelope smiled at the gentle ribbing, so different from the outright hostility he had initially shown her. "Very well, I'll be back to help pack up later." She made her way through the bustling town square, now transformed with harvest decorations, bundles of corn stalks, pumpkins, and gourds arranged artfully around stalls selling everything from apple cider to hand-knit scarves for the coming winter. Children darted between adults, faces sticky with candy, and a fiddler played lively tunes at one end of the square where couples were dancing. Penelope searched the crowd, trying not to admit to herself how eagerly she was looking for Vaughn and Emma. She spotted them near a game stall where Vaughn was attempting to knock down bottles with a ball while balancing Emma on his hip. The sight made her smile. She made her way toward them, nodding in greeting to several patients she passed. "Your aim needs work," she called teasingly as she approached. Vaughn turned, his face lighting up when he saw her. "Penelope, we were beginning to think you might be too busy to join us." The tent quieted down, she explained, reaching out to touch Emma's cheek. "Hello, sweet girl. You're looking very pretty today." Emma was dressed in a clean white gown with a tiny blue ribbon in her dark hair. She squealed happily at the sight of Penelope, reaching for her with determination. "May I?" Penelope asked, holding out her arms. "Of course," Vaughn said, transferring Emma carefully. "Though fair warning, she's been grabbing everything in sight today." As if to prove his point, Emma immediately latched onto one of Penelope's earrings, a simple pearl drop that had belonged to her mother. "No, no," Penelope laughed, gently removing the tiny fingers. "Not for babies, see what I mean," Vaughn grinned. "She's turning into a little bandit." "A very charming one," Penelope conceded. "Have you two been enjoying the festival?" "Very much," Vaughn nodded. Though I confess it's my first proper outing with Emma, I wasn't sure how she'd handle the crowds and noise. And how is she doing? Better than her father, he admitted ruefully. She's fascinated by everything. I'm the one who's nervous every time someone gets too close or makes a sudden movement. Penelope smiled understandingly. That's perfectly natural. The first time is always the hardest. They began walking together through the festival, stopping occasionally to admire handicrafts or sample treats. Vaughn purchased a small wooden rattle from a carpenter's stall and presented it to Emma, who immediately began waving it enthusiastically. I think we have a musician in the making, Penelope laughed as Emma created her own percussive accompaniment to the distant fiddle music. Heaven help me, Vaughn groaned good-naturedly. She's already loud enough without musical instruments. As they walked, Penelope noticed several curious glances directed their way. It wasn't often she was seen in public in a purely social capacity, especially not with a handsome widower and his baby. She could almost hear the gossip starting, but found to her surprise that she didn't much care. Are you hungry? Vaughn asked as they passed a stall selling fried apple pies. My treat to thank you for joining us. That sounds lovely, Penelope agreed, suddenly realizing she hadn't eaten since breakfast. They found a relatively quiet spot at the edge of the square where a few benches had been set up beneath a large oak tree. Vaughn spread a handkerchief on the bench for them to sit on, careful consideration that made Penelope smile. The apple pies were delicious flaky pastry filled with cinnamon-spiced apples and drizzled with honey. Emma watched them eat with such intense interest that Vaughn eventually let her gum on the tiniest piece of crust. I've been meaning to ask, Penelope said as they finished their treat, how do you manage the ranch and Emma all on your own? It seems an impossible task for one person. Vaughn brushed crumbs from his hands before answering. It is challenging, he admitted. I've had to scale back some, sold off half the cattle last spring, keeping just enough to sustain us. I do more horse breeding now, less daily work, better returns. And I have Jeffries and his son who come by 3 days a week to help with the heavier tasks. That's quite a change from what you and Sarah planned, I imagine. A shadow crossed his face. Yes, we had big dreams when we came out here. Sarah wanted a real working ranch, a legacy to pass down to our children. He looked down at Emma, who had fallen asleep against Penelope's chest, the excitement of the day finally catching up with her. Sometimes I worry I'm letting her down, scaling back like this. I don't think you are, Penelope said softly. You're putting your daughter first. Sarah would understand that. I hope so, he murmured. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching the festival activity from their peaceful vantage point. The sun was beginning to lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over everything. What about you? Vaughn asked eventually. Do you ever find it lonely, being a woman in your position? The question caught Penelope off guard with its perceptiveness. Sometimes, she admitted. Medicine is rewarding work, but it can be isolating. Many people in town still view me with suspicion. The women think I'm odd for choosing career over family, and the men, well, they have their own opinions on a woman's capabilities. Fools, the lot of them, Vaughn said with such vehemence that Penelope laughed. Perhaps, but things are changing slowly. Dr. Howard no longer introduces me as the lady doctor, at least just Dr. Baxter. Progress indeed, Vaughn said dryly. It is, actually, Penelope insisted. 2 steps forward, 1 step back, that's how change happens. You're an optimist, he observed. I have to be, otherwise what's the point? The fiddle music had grown louder and several couples were now dancing in the center of the square. Vaughn watched them for a moment, then turned to Penelope. Would you, he began, but was interrupted by a woman's sharp voice. Dr. Baxter, there you are. Penelope looked up to see Mrs. Holloway, the postmaster's wife, hurrying toward them with an anxious expression. Mrs. Holloway, Penelope acknowledged, carefully shifting Emma so as not to wake her. Is something wrong? It's my Henry, the woman explained breathlessly. Fell from the ladder putting up festival banners. Dr. Howard sent me to find you, says it might be a broken arm. Penelope nodded, already rising to her feet. Of course, I'll come at once. She turned apologetically to Vaughn. "I'm sorry, duty calls." "No need to apologize," he said, standing as well and gently taking Emma from her arms. The baby stirred but didn't wake, settling against her father's shoulder with a small sigh. "We understand, don't we, Emma? Thank you for a lovely afternoon," Penelope said sincerely. "The pleasure was ours," Vaughn replied. "Perhaps we could do it again sometime." Something in his tone made Penelope's heart beat a little faster. "I'd like that," she said softly. "So would we," he smiled. "Good luck with Henry's arm." As Penelope followed Mrs. Holloway back toward the medical tent, she couldn't help glancing back over her shoulder. Vaughn still stood beneath the oak tree, Emma sleeping peacefully in his arms, watching her go with an expression that stayed with her long after she'd set Henry Holloway's fractured ulna. The weeks following the Harvest Festival brought an early winter to Montana territory. The first snow fell in late October, earlier than usual, blanketing Whispering Creek and the surrounding prairie in pristine white. For Penelope, winter always meant an increase in illness, coughs and colds, chilblains and frostbite, and the ever-present threat of influenza that haunted her memories of her father's death. Despite her busy schedule, she found time to ride out to Vaughn's homestead at least once a week, ostensibly to check on Emma's continued recovery. The baby had fully regained her health, growing stronger and more active with each visit. She was sitting up on her own now and beginning to experiment with solid foods, much to Vaughn's evident pride. These visits had become the highlight of Penelope's week, though she was reluctant to examine too closely why that might be. She told herself it was professional interest in her patient's progress, combined with the pleasure of seeing a child thrive after such a serious illness. But if she were honest, and Penelope prided herself on her honesty, there was more to it than that. There was something about Vaughn James that drew her to him. His quiet strength, his devotion to his daughter, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. These were dangerous thoughts for a woman who had built her life around her profession. On a particularly cold December afternoon, Penelope arrived at the homestead to find Vaughn outside chopping wood. He paused at her approach, leaning on his axe and raising a hand in greeting. His breath fogged in the frigid air, and his cheeks were reddened from exertion and cold. "You're a welcome sight on such a dreary day," he called as she dismounted. "Where's Emma?" Penelope asked, leading Maple toward the small stable attached to the cabin. "Napping, finally," Vaughn said, setting aside his axe and moving to help her with the horse. "She's been fussy all morning." "I think she might be teething." Their fingers brushed as they both reached for Maple's saddle, and despite the cold, Penelope felt warmth bloom in her cheeks. "That would explain the fussiness," she agreed, quickly withdrawing her hand. "I brought some chamomile oil that might help." "You can rub it on her gums. You think of everything," Vaughn said with a grateful smile. "Come inside and warm up. I've got coffee on the stove." The cabin was wonderfully warm after the biting cold outside, a fire crackling merrily in the hearth. Penelope shed her heavy coat and gloves, rubbing her hands together to restore circulation. The main room had undergone subtle changes since her first visit months ago. A colorful quilt now draped the back of a chair. A vase of dried wildflowers sat on the table, and several well-thumbed books were stacked neatly on a small shelf. "You've been making the place more homey," she observed, accepting the steaming mug Vaughn offered her. "Trying to," he acknowledged, glancing around the cabin. "Sarah always said a house needs a woman's touch to become a home, but I'm doing my best." "You're doing better than most men would," Penelope assured him, sipping her coffee gratefully. "It feels welcoming." Vaughn looked pleased at her words. "I want it to be a good home for Emma. She deserves that much." A small cry from the adjacent room announced that the baby in question was awake. Vaughn moved immediately to fetch her, returning moments later with a red-faced Emma who was indeed showing all the signs of teething discomfort. "Someone's not happy," Penelope observed sympathetically, setting down her coffee and reaching for her medical bag. "Let me show you how to use the chamomile oil." She extracted a small brown bottle and demonstrated how to apply a tiny amount to Emma's inflamed gums. The baby calmed somewhat at the soothing sensation, though she still looked thoroughly disgruntled with the world. "Poor little thing," Penelope murmured. "It's no fun growing teeth." "Is there anything else I can do for her?" Vaughn asked, his concern evident as he cradled his daughter. "A cold cloth for her to chew on sometimes helps," Penelope suggested. "And lots of patience. This phase will pass, though it may not feel like it when she's crying at 3 in the morning." Vaughn's answering laugh held a note of weariness. "You've described my nights exactly. I'd forgotten how little sleep parents get." "You're managing admirably," Penelope assured him. "Many fathers wouldn't be so involved in their child's care." "Many fathers have wives to handle these things," Vaughn pointed out, not bitterly but matter-of-factly. "True," Penelope acknowledged. "But even then, most men leave the child rearing entirely to the women. The fact that you're so hands-on with Emma, it speaks well of you." Vaughn looked slightly embarrassed by her praise. "It's not a choice for me, it's just what needs doing." "That's exactly my point," Penelope smiled. "You do what needs doing without complaint because you love her." Emma had settled somewhat, now contentedly gumming her own fist while nestled in her father's arms. The domestic tableau tugged at something in Penelope's heart, a longing she usually kept firmly buried beneath her professional ambitions. "Would you like to stay for supper?" Vaughn asked suddenly. "I've got a stew that's been simmering all day, nothing fancy, but it's hot and there's plenty." The invitation was tempting. Outside, the short winter day was already fading, and the thought of the cold ride back to town was not appealing. But Penelope was acutely aware of propriety, or rather, the appearance of impropriety that might arise from such an arrangement. "I should really get back before dark," she said reluctantly. "I have patients to see early tomorrow." Disappointment flickered across Vaughn's features but was quickly masked. "Of course, I understand." An awkward silence fell between them, punctuated only by Emma's occasional babbling. "Actually," Vaughn said suddenly, "there was something I wanted to ask you." He took a deep breath as if gathering courage. "The Christmas social is happening in town next week. I was wondering if you might consider accompanying Emma and me, as our guest, I mean." The invitation hung in the air between them, its significance unmistakable. This was not a casual suggestion to meet at a public event as the Harvest Festival had been. This was something more intentional. "Vaughn," Penelope began carefully, "I'm flattered, truly, but I'm not sure it would be." Appropriate," he echoed, looking genuinely confused. "Why not?" "Well, for one thing, Emma was my patient," she explained, feeling uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "And for another, people talk. A single woman and a widower, it would start gossip." "Does that matter so much?" Vaughn asked. "What people say, in my position, yes," Penelope admitted. "I've worked hard to establish myself as a professional in this town. Any hint of impropriety could undermine that." "Impropriety," Vaughn repeated, a hint of frustration entering his voice. "Is that how you see my invitation? As somehow improper?" "No, that's not what I meant," Penelope hastened to clarify. "It's just complicated. My situation is complicated." Vaughn was quiet for a moment, absently stroking Emma's dark hair. "I understand," he said finally, though his tone suggested he didn't, not really. "I wouldn't want to do anything that might harm your standing in the community." Penelope felt a twist of regret at the formality that had crept into his voice. "Vaughn, no need to explain further," he interrupted gently. "I overstepped and I apologize." "You didn't overstep," she insisted. "I'm just cautious by necessity." "Of course," he nodded, his expression carefully neutral. "I should let you get back before the light fades completely." The ride back to town was miserable, and not just because of the biting cold. Penelope replayed the conversation in her mind, wishing she had handled it differently. Vaughn's invitation had caught her off guard, forcing her to confront feelings she had been studiously avoiding. The truth was, she had grown increasingly fond of both Vaughn and Emma over the past months. Their weekly visits had become more than professional obligation, they had become something she looked forward to, planned for, thought about in quiet moments between patients. But acknowledging such feelings was frightening. Penelope had witnessed firsthand how marriage often meant the end of a woman's professional aspirations. Her own mother, once a talented pianist, had set aside her music entirely after marriage, her beautiful hands eventually transformed by housework and child-rearing until they could no longer span an octave on the keyboard. Penelope had vowed never to face such a choice. Her medicine was her life's work, her calling. Could she really risk that for the warm feelings that arose whenever Vaughn smiled at her or Emma reached for her with trusting arms? By the time she reached town, darkness had fallen completely. Lights glowed in windows, and smoke rose from chimneys, creating a scene of cozy domesticity that only heightened her confusion. She stabled Maple and trudged through the snow to her small home attached to her practice, feeling more alone than she had in a very long time. The following days were filled with work, as winter ailments kept Penelope busy from dawn until well after dusk. She told herself it was the heavy workload that prevented her from making her usual visit to Vaughn's homestead, not cowardice or embarrassment over their last interaction. The Christmas social came and went, and Penelope attended only briefly, making an appearance at Dr. Howard's insistence before pleading a headache and returning home early. She had scanned the crowd anxiously, both hoping and dreading to see Vaughn there, but there was no sign of him or Emma. 2 weeks passed without contact, the longest they had gone without seeing each other since that fateful night when Penelope had ridden out to find a desperate father praying over his sick child. She missed them both with an intensity that surprised her, and several times she nearly saddled Maple to make the journey to their homestead. But pride, uncertainty, and fear held her back. It was 3 days after Christmas when everything changed. Penelope was closing her practice for the evening, exhausted after treating a steady stream of patients with winter coughs and fevers, when an urgent knocking shattered the quiet. She opened the door to find Jeffries, the ranch hand who worked for Vaughn, his hat clutched in his hands and anxiety written across his weathered face. "Dr. Baxter," he said breathlessly. "It's Mr. James. There's been an accident." Penelope's heart seized with fear. "What happened?" "Is he hurt badly?" "He was breaking a new horse when the animal spooked at something," Jeffries explained quickly. "Threw him hard against the corral fence. He was unconscious for a spell, and when he came to, he couldn't move his right arm proper. Said it wasn't broken, but he's hurting something fierce." "And Emma?" Penelope asked, already gathering her medical bag and heavy coat. "With him, she's fine, just upset cause her pa's in pain." "I'll come immediately," Penelope said, pulling on her gloves. "Has someone gone for Doctor Howard as well?" Jeffries shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. James asked for you, madam. Specifically?" The knowledge that Vaughn had asked for her by name sent a complicated mixture of emotions through Penelope's chest, but she pushed them aside. Professional concerns came first. "I'll need to borrow your horse," she told Jeffries. "Maple is too tired from yesterday's calls." "Of course, madam," he nodded. "She's right outside." The ride to Vaughn's homestead seemed interminable despite the faster pace of Jeffries' sturdy gelding. Snow had fallen again the previous night, making the trail treacherous in the gathering darkness. Penelope pushed forward, her mind racing with possible injuries and treatments, trying not to imagine worst-case scenarios. When they finally arrived, the cabin was ablaze with lamplight. Penelope dismounted quickly and hurried inside, not bothering to knock. The scene that greeted her sent a pang through her heart. Vaughn sat in a chair by the fire, his face drawn with pain, his right arm held awkwardly across his chest. Emma was in a makeshift playpen nearby, whimpering as if she sensed her father's distress. Vaughn looked up as Penelope entered, relief washing over his features. "Penelope, you came." "Of course I came," she replied, moving immediately to his side and setting down her medical bag. "Did you think I wouldn't?" A shadow crossed his face. "We haven't seen you in a while. I thought perhaps you were avoiding us." Penelope felt a stab of guilt but pushed it aside for the moment. "Let me examine you," she said professionally. "Where exactly is the pain?" "Shoulder," Vaughn grimaced. "When the horse threw me, I hit the fence post at an angle, heard something pop." Penelope nodded, gently helping him remove his shirt to better assess the injury. She tried to maintain clinical detachment as she examined his muscular shoulder, now swollen and already darkening with bruises, but it was difficult. Every wince of pain that crossed his face felt like a physical blow to her own heart. "It's dislocated," she concluded after careful examination. "I'll need to reset it. It's going to hurt, I'm afraid." "I figured as much," Vaughn said grimly. "Just tell me what to do." "First, let me give you something for the pain," Penelope said, opening her medical bag and extracting a small brown bottle. "It won't eliminate it completely, but it might take the edge off." While they waited for the laudanum to take effect, Penelope moved to check on Emma, who had begun crying in earnest. "She hasn't eaten in a while," Vaughn explained apologetically. "I couldn't manage it one-handed, and Jeffries isn't exactly experienced with babies." "I'll take care of her after we fix your shoulder," Penelope promised, picking up the distressed infant and bouncing her gently. "It's all right, sweetheart. Your papa's going to be fine." Emma calmed somewhat at her familiar voice, clutching at Penelope's dress with tiny hands. The trust in the gesture made Penelope's throat tighten unexpectedly. "She's missed you," Vaughn said quietly, watching them together. "We both have." Penelope met his gaze, seeing the unspoken question there. "I've missed you too," she admitted softly. "Both of you." Before Vaughn could respond, Jeffries returned from settling the horses. "Anything else you need, Doc?" he asked. "Yes, actually," Penelope said, grateful for the interruption. "I'll need your help to reset Mr. James's shoulder." With Jeffrey's assistance, Penelope carefully manipulated Vaughn's arm, rotating it slowly until, with a sickening pop that made her stomach lurch, the joint slipped back into place. Vaughn's face went white with pain despite the laudanum, but he didn't cry out, merely exhaled a shaky breath. "There," Penelope said, immediately fashioning a sling from a clean pillowcase. "You'll need to keep it immobilized for at least a week, preferably 2. And no more breaking horses for a while after that." "Yes, doctor," Vaughn replied, the ghost of a smile touching his lips despite his obvious discomfort. Once she had settled Vaughn as comfortably as possible, Penelope turned her attention to Emma. She found milk in the small pantry and warmed it slightly before feeding the hungry baby, who ate enthusiastically and then promptly fell asleep in her arms. "You've got the touch," Jeffries observed as Penelope laid Emma in her cradle. "Takes me half an hour to get her settled and she still fusses." "I've had some practice," Penelope smiled. "Mr. Jeffries, I think Mr. James will be all right now, but he shouldn't be left alone tonight in case the shoulder slips again or he develops a fever." "I'd stay, madam, but my wife's expecting me back," Jeffries said apologetically. "Our youngest has the croup and she's run ragged with the other 3. "I understand," Penelope nodded, making a mental note to check on the Jeffries child tomorrow. "I'll stay with Mr. James tonight." "You will?" Vaughn asked, looking surprised. "Doctor's orders," Penelope said firmly. "Someone needs to monitor your condition, and Emma needs care you can't provide one-handed." Jeffries took his leave shortly after, promising to return in the morning to help with the ranch chores. Once he was gone, a strange awkwardness fell between Penelope and Vaughn, as if they were both acutely aware of their solitude and the unresolved tension from their last meeting. "Thank you," Vaughn said finally, breaking the silence, "for coming and for staying." "I know it's not what you would choose." Penelope busied herself building up the fire. "What makes you say that? The last time we spoke, you made it clear that being here with me wasn't appropriate," he reminded her, his voice carefully neutral. Penelope turned to face him, seeing the hurt beneath his composed expression. "That's not exactly what I said," she corrected gently, "and regardless, this is different. This is a medical necessity." "Is that all it is?" Vaughn asked quietly. "Professional obligation?" The question hung between them, demanding honesty Penelope wasn't sure she was ready to give. But looking at Vaughn, his face pale with pain, his eyes holding a vulnerability that matched her own unspoken feelings, she found she couldn't dissemble. "No," she admitted softly, "it's not all it is." Vaughn's expression softened. "Then why have you been staying away, Penelope?" She sank into the chair opposite his, gathering her thoughts. "Because I'm afraid," she confessed finally, "of what I'm beginning to feel for you, for both of you, of what it might mean for everything I've worked for." I would never ask you to give up your work, Vaughn said immediately. Never, it's who you are. Intentions are one thing, reality another, Penelope replied. I've seen too many women forced to choose between family and profession. It's why I've always kept my heart guarded, until now. Vaughn asked, a note of hope in his voice. Penelope met his gaze steadily. Until now, she confirmed. You and Emma, you found your way past my defenses, and I don't quite know what to do about it. You don't have to do anything right now, Vaughn assured her. Except perhaps forgive yourself for having feelings that frighten you. His understanding, free from pressure or expectation, touched Penelope deeply. When did you become so wise? She asked, attempting to lighten the moment. Probably around the time I found myself a single father with no idea what I was doing, he smiled ruefully. Nothing clarifies your thinking quite like complete terror. Penelope laughed softly, feeling some of the tension dissipate. I imagine not. They talked late into the night, Vaughn's pain gradually easing enough to allow him to share stories of his childhood in Boston, his decision to come west, his meeting and falling in love with Sarah. Penelope, in turn, spoke of her father's influence on her choice of profession, her struggles at medical school where she was one of only 3 women, her determination to prove herself in a man's world. When Emma woke crying around midnight, Penelope tended to her, changing her and warming more milk before bringing her back to the main room. Instead of returning the baby to her cradle, she sat with Emma cradled against her chest, the infant's warm weight and steady breathing a comfort in the quiet night. You're a natural with her, Vaughn observed drowsily, the laudanum making his speech slightly slurred. She trusts you completely. The feeling is mutual, Penelope admitted, stroking Emma's dark hair. She's a remarkable baby. She has her mother's spirit, Vaughn said softly, and her beauty, I think. But your eyes, Penelope noted, exactly the same shade of blue. My mother always said blue eyes were a sign of a dreamer, Vaughn murmured, his own eyes growing heavy with approaching sleep. Said I'd never be content staying in one place. And was she right? Until recently, Vaughn answered, his gaze finding hers across the dim room. Lately, I've been thinking that maybe staying put has its merits if you're with the right people. The implication in his words was unmistakable. Penelope felt her cheeks warm but didn't look away. Perhaps it does, she agreed softly. Vaughn's eyes drifted closed, his breathing deepening as sleep claimed him. Penelope remained awake, watching over father and daughter, her heart full of emotions she was only beginning to understand. Morning brought clarity, as it often did. Penelope woke curled uncomfortably in the chair, Emma still sleeping peacefully against her chest. Vaughn was already awake, watching them with an expression of such tenderness that Penelope felt momentarily breathless. Good morning, he said quietly. You two looked so peaceful, I didn't want to disturb you. How's the shoulder? Penelope asked, carefully rising with Emma. Sore, but better, he reported. You were right, keeping it immobilized helps. Doctors usually are right, she teased, laying Emma in her cradle before stretching her stiff muscles. At least about medical matters. And what about matters of the heart? Vaughn asked, his tone light but his eyes serious. Are doctors right about those too? Penelope paused, considering her answer carefully. In my experience, the heart is far more complicated than any anatomy textbook suggests, she said finally. It doesn't always follow scientific principles. No, Vaughn agreed, it certainly doesn't. They shared a simple breakfast, Jeffries arriving as promised to help with the morning chores. Penelope prepared to leave, though with none of the awkwardness or uncertainty of her previous departure. I'll come back tomorrow to check on your shoulder, she promised as Vaughn walked her to her horse, Emma bundled against the cold in his good arm, and to see this little one, of course. We'll be here, Vaughn assured her, though perhaps next time you might come just to visit, not as Dr. Baxter, but as Penelope. The invitation was clear, the choice being offered respectfully. Penelope looked at him, at the hope in his eyes, at Emma watching her with innocent curiosity, and found her answer wasn't as difficult as she had feared. I'd like that, she said simply. Vaughn's smile was like the sun breaking through winter clouds. So would we. As Penelope rode back toward town, she felt lighter somehow, as if a burden she hadn't fully acknowledged had been lifted from her shoulders. The future held no certainties, it never did, but for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to imagine possibilities beyond her carefully constructed professional life. True to her word, Penelope returned the next day and the day after that. Her visits to the James homestead became a regular occurrence, no longer justified by medical necessity but by the simple pleasure of their company. Winter gradually loosened its grip on the Montana prairie, snow melting to reveal the first tentative green shoots of spring. As Vaughn's shoulder healed, he and Penelope fell into a comfortable routine. She would arrive in the late afternoon after her patients had been seen and stay for supper. Sometimes they would sit by the fire afterward, Vaughn reading aloud from one of his books while Penelope mended clothing or played with Emma, who was now crawling enthusiastically and attempting to pull herself up on furniture. On Sundays, if weather permitted, they would ride into town together for church services, ignoring the curious glances and whispered comments their appearance as a trio inevitably provoked. Dr. Howard, to Penelope's surprise, seemed quietly supportive of the developing relationship, going so far as to adjust patient schedules to allow her more time away from the practice. "Life is short, Dr. Baxter," he told her gruffly one afternoon when she thanked him for his consideration. "Medicine is a calling, but it needn't be a solitary one." It was a mild April evening when everything shifted again. Penelope arrived at the homestead to find Vaughn outside, watching Emma crawl determinedly across a blanket he had spread on the new spring grass. The scene was so domestic, so perfect in its simplicity, that Penelope felt her heart constrict with emotion. "There you are," Vaughn called, his face lighting up at her approach. "We were beginning to think you'd forgotten us." "Never," Penelope replied, dismounting and leading Maple to the small corral where the mare was now accustomed to spending time while her mistress visited. Mrs. Johnson's baby decided to arrive early, a healthy boy, 8 pounds even. "Another successful delivery," Vaughn smiled proudly. "You must be exhausted." "Happily so," Penelope assured him, kneeling on the blanket beside Emma, who immediately abandoned her exploration to crawl toward her, babbling excitedly. "Hello, sweetheart, what adventures have you had today?" "She stood on her own for nearly 10 seconds, Vaughn reported proudly. "No support at all, I think walking isn't far behind." "Is that so?" Penelope exclaimed, lifting Emma into her arms and pressing a kiss to her chubby cheek. "You're growing up so fast, Miss Emma." "Too fast," Vaughn agreed, a hint of wistfulness in his tone. "Before we know it, she'll be running around and getting into all sorts of trouble." "And talking back," Penelope added teasingly. "Don't forget that part." They shared a laugh, the easy companionship between them a comfort that Penelope had come to cherish. Emma squirmed to be put down again, immediately resuming her determined crawling across the blanket. "I have something to show you," Vaughn said, a note of nervous excitement entering his voice. "If you're not too tired." "Not for you," Penelope replied honestly. "What is it?" "It's a short ride from here," he explained, nodding toward the horses. "I can bring Emma in the sling." Curious, Penelope agreed. They saddled Maple and Vaughn's gelding, secured Emma safely against her father's chest, and set off across the prairie. The evening was perfect for riding, warm enough to be comfortable, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of new growth and distant rain. They rode for perhaps 20 minutes, cresting a small hill that overlooked a winding creek bordered by cottonwood trees. In the valley below, a meadow of early wildflowers spread out like a colorful carpet, purple lupines and yellow buttercups dotting the green expanse. "It's beautiful," Penelope breathed, taking in the scenic vista. "This is my land," Vaughn explained, pride evident in his voice. "I own from the ridge we just crossed to the creek and about a mile in either direction." "It's quite a spread," Penelope nodded, understanding his pride in the accomplishment. "I've been thinking," Vaughn continued, suddenly sounding uncertain. "This spot here where we're sitting, it would make a fine building site. Good drainage, protected from the north wind by that ridge, plenty of water from the creek." Penelope looked at him curiously, noting the way he avoided her eyes, focusing instead on the landscape before them. "Are you planning to build something?" "I was hoping to," he admitted. "A proper house with a separate room for Emma as she grows and a covered porch facing west to watch the sunsets." He paused, then added more quietly, "And maybe a small office where a doctor could see patients if she wanted to." Penelope's breath caught as she realized what he was suggesting. "Vaughn, I know what you're afraid of," he said quickly, finally meeting her gaze. "That loving someone means giving up your independence, your work, but it doesn't have to be that way, Penelope, not with me." He gestured toward the valley below. "You could have your practice in town and here. Split your time however you need to. I'd never ask you to be less than who you are." He looked down at Emma, who was contentedly playing with a button on his shirt. "We both need you exactly as you are." Tears pricked at Penelope's eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. "You've thought this through, haven't you?" "For months," Vaughn admitted. "Since that night you stayed with us after my accident, maybe even before. I just wasn't sure if you felt the same, if you could see a future that included us." Penelope's mind raced with competing thoughts, practical considerations about her practice, her independence, the challenge of balancing professional and personal obligations. But beneath these logical concerns, her heart recognized the truth she had been circling for months. "I love you," she said simply, the words feeling right the moment they left her lips. "Both of you. I've been trying to pretend otherwise, trying to keep my feelings contained in neat, professional boundaries, but it hasn't worked." "Thank God," Vaughn breathed, relief washing over his features. "Because I love you too, Penelope. So much it terrifies me sometimes." Emma, as if sensing the emotional moment unfolding between the adults, chose that moment to let out a happy squeal, reaching toward Penelope with demanding hands. "And you," Penelope laughed, tears now flowing freely as she leaned over to kiss Emma's head. "I love you too, little miss. She knows it," Vaughn said softly. "She's loved you since that first night when you fought so hard to save her." They sat in silence for a moment, the magnitude of their declarations settling around them like a comfortable blanket. "I'm not asking for an answer right now," Vaughn said eventually. "About the house, about us, I want you to take all the time you need to be sure. I just wanted you to know what I hope for." Penelope considered his words, looking out over the beautiful valley that could be their home. The fears that had held her back for so long hadn't vanished, but they had diminished in the face of the love she felt for this man and his daughter. "What if I don't need more time?" she asked quietly. "What if I already know what I want?" Vaughn's expression was a mixture of hope and disbelief. "And what is it that you want, Penelope?" "This," she said simply, gesturing to the three of them. "You, Emma, a life together. A practice that lets me be a doctor and a wife and maybe someday a mother too. It won't be easy, and there will be challenges we can't even anticipate, but I want to face them with you." The joy that transformed Vaughn's features was answer enough, but he spoke anyway, his voice rough with emotion. "I promise you, Penelope, I will do everything in my power to make this work, whatever you need, however you need it to be." "I believe you," she said, and realized with some surprise that she truly did. "That's why I can say yes." They married on a perfect June day, with Emma now taking her first tentative steps, serving as their only attendant. Dr. Howard stood up as witness, along with Mrs. Rodriguez, who had become a friend to Penelope after she had successfully delivered the woman's twins the previous year. The ceremony was simple, held in the small church in Whispering Creek, followed by a modest reception at the hotel dining room. If some townspeople still raised eyebrows at the unconventional couple, the female doctor and the widowed rancher, they kept their opinions mostly to themselves. True to his word, Vaughn began construction on their new home the week after the wedding. Penelope continued her practice in town, riding out to the homestead each evening to the welcoming arms of her new family. When the house was completed in late summer, they moved in together. Penelope's medical books taking pride of place in the small office Vaughn had designed especially for her. As autumn painted the prairie in golds and reds, Penelope found herself making plans for a small clinic adjacent to their home, where she could see patients from the surrounding ranches without the long ride into town. Vaughn supported her vision wholeheartedly, offering suggestions for layout and even beginning to gather lumber for the project before winter set in. Emma thrived under their combined care, growing from a toddling baby into a curious, active child who followed her father around the ranch and helped Penelope organize her medical supplies. Her first full sentence, uttered one evening as they sat together by the fire, was "Mama, fix it," as she handed Penelope a doll with a loose arm, a moment that reduced both adults to emotional speechlessness. It was a year to the day after Penelope had first ridden out to find a desperate father praying over his sick child that she shared her own news with Vaughn. They were sitting on the porch after dinner, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues, Emma already asleep inside. "I've been meaning to tell you something," Penelope said, a nervous smile playing at her lips. Vaughn turned to her, his expression curious. "What is it?" "I believe Emma will have a sibling around next spring," she said, watching his face closely, "if my medical training serves me correctly." For a moment, Vaughn simply stared at her, processing her words. Then his face transformed with joy, and he gathered her into his arms so quickly that her feet left the ground. "Careful," she laughed against his shoulder. "There's a baby in there." "Our baby," he whispered, setting her gently back on her feet but keeping his arms around her. "Are you sure?" "As sure as I can be," she nodded. "I've been suspecting for a few weeks now." "How do you feel about it?" Vaughn asked, his concern evident. "With your practice and the clinic plans, nervous," she admitted honestly. "But happy, so very happy." Vaughn, the smile that lit his face, was everything she could have hoped for. "I love you," he said simply. "And I love you," she replied. "Even when you leave your boots in the middle of the floor," Vaughn laughed, drawing her close again. "I promise to be more tidy when the baby comes." "I'll hold you to that," Penelope smiled, leaning her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. As darkness settled around them, stars emerging one by one in the vast Montana sky, Penelope reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From that desperate night when she had found a cowboy holding his sick baby, whispering prayers into the darkness, to this peaceful evening on their own porch, expecting a child of their own, it was a path she could never have imagined for herself. Yet here she stood, a doctor still, a wife now too, and soon to be a mother. Not diminished by love as she had once feared, but expanded by it, growing into a life richer and more fulfilling than she had dared to dream possible. "What are you thinking about?" Vaughn asked softly, his fingers gently stroking her hair. "About answered prayers," Penelope replied, smiling up at him in the gathering darkness. "And how sometimes they come in forms we never expected." Vaughn's arms tightened around her. "I thank God every day that you rode out to us that night," he murmured against her hair. "You saved more than Emma's life, you know. You saved mine too." "We saved each other," Penelope corrected gently, "and that's the most beautiful kind of prayer there is." As if in agreement, a shooting star blazed across the night sky above them, a brief, brilliant reminder of all the wishes that had brought them to this perfect moment, and all the dreams still waiting to unfold in the life they would build together.